Hey everyone, it's Mark from Flight Sim School, and we are back today with the final part of the Comanche deep dive. And today we're going to be focusing on navigation by looking at all of the autopilot modes, and we're also going to look at speed management on the descent and a couple of different tips for landing. There are a lot of subtleties to know about when it comes to all of those topics, so make sure that you stick around so you can get the most from this top-notch airplane. We're continuing from where we left off in part 2, and we're flying north towards Inverness, and we're going to start off today with a review of all of the autopilot modes that you can use and when's best to use each one of them. The autopilot in this plane is very different because it's what's called a rate-based autopilot, which is built around the turn coordinator rather than the attitude-based autopilots that you're going to find in most planes, and that means that it doesn't have quite the same functionality as you might be used to, and we'll see that as we go here. We'll start off by initializing the autopilot with the master switch, and that's going to light up all of the indicators on it for a couple of seconds as it goes through its initialization sequence. Once the initialization's completed itself, the green ready light on the left hand side is going to be the only one that's left illuminated. And the first mode that we're going to look at on the autopilot is stabilizer mode, or ST, which allows you to tell the plane to fly with wings level or to hold a turn left or right. I only use this mode in one situation, and that's when I'm not yet using the autopilot and I just need the airplane to keep flying straight for me while I'm doing something else that takes my attention away from the outside. So for example, programming the GPS without having to worry that the plane's going to turn due to wind or anything like that. To get into stabilizer mode, you've got to press the mode button until the light above ST in the turn coordinator is lit up. And by default it's going to start in wings level mode, so if you're already in a turn it's going to straighten you out and keep it that way, which is a pretty useful feature. You can also make it hold a turn either to the left or right for you by twisting the mode knob in the direction that you want it to turn. And once you're in the turn, it's going to keep flying in that turn until you tell it not to, so you've got to bring the knob back towards the center to level it out, or if you want to go in the other direction, you've got to twist it even more to the right. Personally, I don't use this feature very much of ST mode. I really only use it to keep the wings level when I need it to, and if I have to turn either left or right, what I'm going to do is use heading mode instead. There is one important thing to know about though when you're using heading mode, and that's that over time the HSI's heading indicator is going to be affected by something called gyro drift, which means that it's actually going to end up pointing in the completely wrong direction after a while. We can see that effect right now actually, because I haven't adjusted for drift since I took off, and our heading indicator is pointing at 050 on the HSI, but our magnetic compass is pointing at around 030, so there's about a 20-degree difference there. When the right-hand knob of the HSI is pushed in, twisting it either to the left or right is going to turn the entire heading indicator, and what you're trying to do is to turn it until the heading right at the top of the HSI matches up with what's shown on the magnetic compass. Right now our magnetic compass is pointing at 030, so I'm going to twist the knob on the HSI until it's pointing at the same thing. But if you're flying in any type of wind or there's turbulence, the compass can tend to bounce around a fair bit and it doesn't like to settle down. So what I actually do most of the time is just press the D key every 15 minutes or so, and that's going to automatically reset the HSI to the magnetic compass's value automatically for me, and it's going to save me just that little bit of work. Alright, so like I was alluding to, the other function of this knob when you click on it to pull it out is to set your heading bug when you switch the autopilot into heading mode. Again, you need to twist it left or right, and it's going to move the bug, which is that green triangle on the inside of the HSI. Right now though, I'm still in stabilizer mode, so I need to switch the autopilot mode into heading mode. So to do that, I'm going to press the mode button again, and you can see that now it's illuminated the HD light on the turn coordinator, which means that we're now in heading mode. So now when I move the heading bug, our plane is going to follow it and turn to the new heading that I've set it to. And this is probably the mode that I use the most because it frees me up to do other stuff at the same time, but I also retain that control over what the airplane's doing. We're going to get back to the Comanche in just a second, but I want to remind you to hit the like button if you've learned something useful today, and make sure that you subscribe as well so you don't miss out on the next airplane that we're going to be covering on the channel. The next mode that we're going to look at today is altitude hold mode, which you enable by pressing the altitude engage disengage button that's either on the yoke if you have it up, or right below where it would normally be if you have it hidden like I do here. When you press the button, the blue indicator light in the top left of the turn coordinator is going to turn on to tell you that it's engaged, and it's going to try and hold whatever altitude that you're at when you enabled it, but you should really only press the button when you're already level at a given altitude and mostly trimmed out, because this autopilot can't make trim adjustments for you, so it's going to struggle to hold the altitude if you enable it during a climb or a descent. Anytime that the trim needs adjustment once altitude hold mode is on, you're going to hear a constant beeping sound, and if you look at the turn coordinator, one of the two lights on the right hand side should be flashing to tell you that it needs you to trim the plane either up or down. When the up light is illuminated like it is now, you're going to need to add some pitch up trim, and if the down light illuminates on the other hand, as you can probably guess, you're going to have to do the opposite and add some pitch down trim. How much trim you actually need to apply is going to depend on how out of trim the airplane is when you enabled altitude mode, and if you were mostly stable at the time that you enabled it, then you should only need to make small adjustments, but if it's well out of trim, you'll have to add in more until the light turns itself off. Otherwise, you're going to see that your altitude is going to start fluctuating a bit as it struggles to hold the altitude that you told it to. Even once you have it stabilized, there are a few things that can cause the plane to come out of trim once you have it set up properly. Things like changes in airspeed, wind changes, and even as you burn fuel, the center of gravity is going to move, which can cause it to go off as well. So just be on the lookout for the trim alarm if any of those things happen during your flight. The last thing to know about altitude hold mode is you can only enable it once you have a lateral mode on already, either stabilizer, heading, or either of the track modes, which we're going to look at next. The last two navigation modes are low track and high track, which are effectively a more basic version of the nav mode that you might be familiar with from other autopilots. If we glance over at the GPS, we can see that the flight path that we're meant to be following is just to the right of us. So to get back on course, we got to do two things. First, we're going to set our HSI to display our track correctly, and then we're going to navigate back to our flight path. If we go into the flight plan, you can see our course from the departure airport to the next waypoint is on a track of 036. So to make sure that the autopilot sees the right information, because it reads it from the HSI rather than the GPS, we have to make sure that the yellow arrow of the HSI is pointing at 036 as well. It's already set correctly because I did it all before takeoff, but if it wasn't, you'd have to set it manually by twisting the OBS knob until it was lined up in the right spot. And because there is no digital display to tell you what course that it's set to, it's going to be approximate unless your course that you're trying to fly is a multiple of 5, because you have those notches every 5 degrees on the heading indicator. So you could set those accurately, but for something like 036 that we're trying to set it to today, it's going to be a best guess. The HSI is really just a top-down view with the airplane in the middle, and the yellow moving line represents our flight path, and it's showing that it's to the right of us right now, which matches up with what we're seeing on the GPS. So to get back on course, I'm going to use first heading mode to turn to a heading of about 070 so that we can get going in the right direction back towards our flight path. I'm not using either the low or the high track modes yet, because they're not really meant to be used to intercept the course. What they're really there for is to keep you on a course once you're almost right on top of it, and we're going to see a demo of that in just a second here. So for now, I'm going to keep flying on heading mode, and I'm watching for the yellow flight path to start getting closer to our airplane at the center of the HSI, and we'll see it as well on the GPS as we get closer and closer to the magenta line. And what I would normally do is just progressively work my way back from our current heading of 070 more towards our desired track of 036 as I get closer and closer to the flight path. We're just about coming up on the flight path now, both on the GPS and on the HSI, and to demonstrate why you shouldn't be using track mode to get on the course that you're trying to fly, I'm going to switch it into high track now, and we can watch what happens as it tries to intercept the course. You can see the flight path is coming closer and closer to us every second now, and the plane is only just now very slowly starting to turn towards the 036 course that we told it we want to fly, and it's actually going to overshoot the course and end up on the other side of it in just a couple of seconds here. It's going to continue to hunt for the course left and right, and it will eventually get back on it, but it's really best to use heading mode to slowly get back on track, and once you're just a few degrees off, that's when you can enable high track mode and it'll sort out the rest for you. As for the difference between low track and high track, the main thing to know is that low track is going to be less responsive to changes in the yellow CDI needle, so it's going to take it even longer to react if you get blown off course, and the needle is likely going to bounce around a fair bit from the center of the dial. In high track mode, it does a better job of keeping you on the track that you've set, but it's still not 100% as we've seen. So regardless of what mode you're going to be using, you're going to want to keep an eye on it, and it's why I generally only use it for flying in a straight line. Alright, we're about 2 miles short of our next waypoint on the GPS, so it's time to have a look at how to handle that, and just like before, it's going to be a 3-step process. First, we're going to set the HSI to the new course that we want to fly, then we'll switch into heading mode to get on that course, and lastly, once we've rolled out on around the right heading, we're going to go back into high track mode and let the airplane sort out getting right on the course. We can get the new course that we need to fly by either checking the flight plan page and looking in the direct track column for the waypoint we're going to be flying to next, or you can just wait until you get close to the waypoint and you'll get a little message at the bottom of the GPS that's going to tell you what course did you need to fly to get to that next waypoint. Either way, it's going to give you the exact same value. For now, it's saying that we need to fly on a course of 068, so I'll start by turning the OBS knob to the new course, and then I'll switch into heading mode by pressing the mode button a couple of times so that it loops around to the beginning, and we can set the heading bug to just a couple of degrees past our new course, so about 070, so that we're again on an intercept course to get back on our flight path. So long as you make the course and heading change as you're flying over the waypoint, you should be able to re-enable track mode almost immediately because you shouldn't be that far off course yet, and it'll take care of bringing you back on track the rest of the way. So as we've seen now in both cases, this autopilot will follow the course you tell it to, but you definitely need to keep an eye on it and you need to help it out sometimes, and you can't really leave it unattended for too long because otherwise you may end up way off course. I use the 3-to-1 rule to calculate my top of descent with the Comanche, so I'll take the thousands of feet that I need to descend, so around 5 in this case, and I'll multiply that by 3, which is going to tell me that I need to start my descent around 15 miles out. I like adding a little bit of buffer to that, so I'll make it 18 miles, and once we're ready to descend, the first thing that needs to happen is to disable the altitude hold mode. And then once I'm ready, the next thing that I'm going to do is slowly cut the throttle back to about 12 inches on the manifold pressure, and we'll start descending almost immediately. I find 800 feet per minute to be the sweet spot that isn't too aggressive, but it'll also help get me down relatively fast. And since I've got a good ways to go until we get to pattern altitude, I'll retrim the plane so it can hold that pitch all the way down to my level off altitude. When I'm about 1500 feet above pattern altitude is where I'm going to start thinking about slowing down, because as you've probably seen yourself, the Comanche retains a lot of speed on the descent even with the power set to low. What I do at this point is just bring the mixture back to full rich so our engine's getting enough fuel at this lower altitude, and then I'll bring the RPM back to 2500 RPM, which is going to take a much bigger chunk of air out and help to slow us down. The main thing though is to bring the power all the way back to idle at this point, which is gonna cause the gear horn to go off because the wheels are still up, but it's the best and fastest way to burn off that excess airspeed. That might bring up a red CLD message on the engine monitor to warn you against shock cooling the engine, and to get rid of that you can just add in the slightest bit of power back until the message disappears, but from what I've read it's actually fairly difficult to shock cool this engine anyways. Having the power at or near idle is going to bring you well below the 150 knot extension speed for the gear, which you can also extend now if you've miscalculated your top of descent and you need a little bit more drag to increase your descent rate without picking up more speed. My goal is to be at around 120 knots as I enter the traffic pattern, which is still a bit fast if there's other traffic around, so you may have to make it a little bit slower than that, but for the most part it should be fine. By the time that I roll out on final, I'll just do a couple of quick checks to make sure that I'm configured for landing properly. So I'll check that the mixture is full rich, the prop is full forward, and the power is set to hold 500 feet per minute on the descent with an airspeed of around 90 knots. Obviously, you'll want to double check that the gear is down, and I set the flaps to the second position rather than full flaps for landing, especially in windy conditions, because I find it's just a little bit easier to land the airplane that way. The key thing though is really to keep an eye on your airspeed, and don't be afraid to pull the power out if you're still above 90 on short final, because you won't be able to land if you're any faster than that without putting too much stress on the airplane. I keep the power on about 10 inches of manifold pressure as I go over the threshold, because power off causes the plane to decelerate really quickly, and I focus on just keeping the runway center line. When you're just a few feet above the runway, that's when you can pull the power out and start your flare so that you touch down on the main gear first. If you need to stop quickly on a short field, you should bring the flaps up as soon as you touch down and keep pulling back on the controls to put the maximum amount of weight on the main gear, which is going to help keep more traction on those rear tires as you slow down. The only thing that you have to be careful of though is if you're applying full brakes is to not lock up the wheels, so make sure that you apply the brakes smoothly. And you may also cause them to overheat as well if you're a little bit too aggressive with them, and they may end up not working at all and you'll overshoot the runway, which may or may not be the way my first landing with the Comanche ended. That's going to wrap up our deep dive on everything to do with the A2A Comanche, and if you learned something useful, please make sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing as well.